I think he just might choose to accept. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be ranking the 8 films of the Mission Impossible franchise as part of my franchise Rankography series. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. So what is a Rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them, rather than any specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the Mission Impossible franchise in the comments below. This franchise technically has its roots going all the way back to the 60s with the Mission Impossible TV show, but even as just a film franchise, Mission Impossible has run for nearly 3 decades at this point. Fronted by Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt, this franchise has evolved quite a bit over the decades. You take a look at the first movie and the latest, and it's almost hard to believe that they're part of the same franchise. What began as a stylish and atmospheric espionage thriller has become one of the most consistently awe-inspiring action franchises ever. I've already reviewed all 8 of these movies on this channel, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put links in the description below, and I'll also link some of them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this rankography started. Coming in at number 8, Mission Impossible 2. Even though I don't hate this movie, or even really dislike it, it's unquestionably the weakest entry in the franchise. The early films in the series are all fairly different from one another, but it's difficult to overstate just how massive of a stylistic shift it was jumping from the first film to this one. While the original film was a slick, atmospheric espionage thriller, this was a bombastic romantic action movie. The mystery and slow burn qualities of the first film are chucked aside in favor of what can only be described as the epitome of early 2000s action. Extremely saturated high contrast visuals, a constant pulsating electronic rock score, tons of quick cut editing, and more slow motion than the entire franchise should have. It's basically a time capsule showcasing everything about the era's style. That time capsule quality even extends to the plot, with a biotechnology virus storyline that feels like it was in just about every other movie in the 2000s. It's okay, just very derivative, making it the least interesting and most generic story in the franchise. This film came out towards the tail end of the Brosnan era of the James Bond films, and it's clear that this movie was really trying to compete with those films. Mission Impossible 2 does give us Newton's character, Naya, who's pretty good at first, but ends up being disappointingly underutilized in the story. Speaking of disappointing, this is one of the only Mission Impossible films that I would put the action on the con side. It's big and kind of fun in a nostalgic way, but it's so ridiculously cheesy. We have to credit the film's stylistic change for setting the franchise on the action path it's still on to this day, but I'm just glad that it's improved on that front over the years. Coming in at number 7, Mission Impossible. Not gonna lie, it feels weird to be putting this film so low on the list. In most franchises, the first movie is usually at or near the top of the ranking for me, because it's the foundation that everything else is built on. The story, the style, the characters. But, with the exception of Ethan Hunt and Luther, there's very little of this film that's recognizable in the rest of the franchise. Not just now, but even as early as Mission Impossible 2. So, this movie ends up feeling less like a foundational building block of the franchise, and more like an outlier. An enjoyable outlier, but still an outlier. Although I consider the Mission Impossible franchise to be one of the best action franchises out there, this first film isn't even really an action movie. It's got a few moments of fairly subdued action, but nothing close to what would become standard for the franchise in later years. Instead, this is a moody and atmospheric espionage thriller. At its core, it's actually a mystery film, so it's a much more suspense-driven slow burn than is typical of a modern spy movie. And that atmosphere is one of the film's strongest elements. It's suspenseful and has this paranoid uneasiness hanging over it, because the characters, and by extension we as the audience, don't know who to trust. But despite a strong premise, this movie gets so hung up on trying to be twisty and surprising that it ends up becoming kind of convoluted. There's an unnecessary degree of complexity here when a tighter and more streamlined story would have been much more effective. Coming in at number 6, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. So I've been struggling with where I was going to place this film since I saw it. To be completely honest, I think this could just as easily be in the 7th spot for me, but at least today, after just this first watch, I'm putting it slightly, just barely ahead of the first film. I guess it's kind of funny that after 8 movies, I end up with the first movie and the supposedly last movie right next to each other in the ranking. That said, this film is way further down in the ranking than I was expecting it to be. I know people had pretty mixed opinions on Dead Reckoning, but I liked that movie quite a bit, so I was really looking forward to part 2 and seeing how they were going to wrap up that story. And this movie's okay. It's far from bad, but it's just not quite a satisfying end to either the Dead Reckoning storyline or the franchise as a whole for me. Especially after what part 1 of this film delivered, I gotta say that the story was a pretty big letdown here. It got unnecessarily convoluted and a bit haphazard at times, focusing more on exposition and callbacks to the previous 7 movies than on telling its own story. I was especially disappointed to see Ethan separated from the rest of his IMF team for so long, because those interactions have been a big part of both the heart and fun of this franchise in recent years. It's a very gloomy and self-serious movie, lacking the levity that most of the movies have brought to the franchise in the last 14 years. The pacing is surprisingly slow, and I was even more surprised by how amateurish a lot of the editing was, at least in the first half of the movie. Things improved quite a bit as it went along, but I think that might mostly be due to the big action set pieces taking place in the last half. Overall, this is a much less action-packed movie than we've seen from the franchise in the last decade and a half or so. But that's not to say it doesn't entertainingly deliver on the crazy big practical action we've come to expect from the franchise. Coming in at number 5, Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation. So I know we're still down in the lower part of the ranking right now, but we've made the transition to Mission Impossible movies that I really enjoy. Honestly, it feels weird putting Rogue Nation in the 5th spot, because there's so much to like about it. As usual in the later films in the franchise, the action's spectacular. Not quite as continuously exciting as some of the films higher up in the ranking, but still really good. The whole underwater infiltration scene is excitingly suspenseful, but the Casablanca chase sequence might just be my favorite in the film. In addition to the action, this one also excels with its characters. We've got some of the returning favorites, plus a decent villain, but the best new addition, and maybe the best character in the film period, is Rebecca Ferguson's Ilsa Faust. She's an ambiguous character, which keeps her interesting from a story perspective, but she's also a character who can match Ethan Hunt in both skills and mindset. Unfortunately, the story is what lands this mission fairly low on the franchise list. The premise of an anti-IMF is really interesting, as is the decommissioning of the IMF proper, but those ideas aren't enough to keep this one as interesting as it sounds like it should be. There are actually a lot of similarities to Ghost Protocol, which, again, sounds like a good thing, but instead it just feels like a lesser version of that movie. Apart from momentary bouts of excitement during the action sequences, the story strangely lacks a sense of urgency throughout its first half especially. It's fun enough to watch, but doesn't have the propulsive story that its franchise mates have. This would have been a really excellent film in most other circumstances, but its placement in the franchise was a challenge. I mean, any film would have a tough time being sandwiched between Ghost Protocol and Fallout. Coming in at number 4, Mission Impossible 3. So I know I've got this film pretty much right in the middle of the pack when it comes to this ranking, but that's more a comment on this franchise than it is on this film, because I think this movie's excellent. I've mentioned it before, but the first 3 films in this franchise are pretty distinct from one another. We've got a couple characters who make the jump from film to film, but stylistically, they're incredibly different. There was an almost episodic nature to them. Fitting, I suppose, given the TV origins of the franchise. But this third film really served as a course correction and became the stylistic and story blueprint for the franchise moving forward. 10 years after the release of the first film, we finally get to see a different side of Ethan Hunt. He always had skillful coolness to him, but in this film, he's actually interesting as a character. He's matured some, and the plot of the story isn't just about the mission at hand, but also about him. It really showcases the human side of the job, as we see Hunt trying to balance the mission with his personal life, and grapple with the consequences of those two parts of his life intersecting. Philip Seymour Hoffman is excellent as the main villain, but I think he's actually underutilized, and I wish we had some more interaction with him. But what's not underutilized here is the action. Sure, the second film had a ton of action too, but unlike that movie, there's not a shred of cheese here. It still has the DNA of a mid-2000s action film, but it's very in line with what would come in the later films, with a lot of raw, impactful practical stunts that are gritty enough to feel real, but still sleek enough to feel like Mission Impossible. Coming in at number 3, Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. Mission Impossible 3 was the movie that really got me into the franchise, but this is the one that made me a true fan. For a number of years, this was number 1 in my ranking, and I doubted it would ever be topped. It's number 3 now, so obviously it has been somehow, but I still love this movie. Mission Impossible 3 was the franchise's major course correction, but Ghost Protocol was the beginning of the second era of this franchise, giving us everything we expect from a Mission Impossible movie, but taking it all to the next level. Or should I say about 130 levels. The story is streamlined and fairly straightforward, dropping the complexities and convolution of its predecessors in favor of a classic espionage plotline. But the excitement of the story easily overrides any initial plot familiarity we might have, and the driving pace keeps us exhilarated and entertained, but never exhausted. The story suffers from a forgettable villain, at least in terms of characterization, but keeps us occupied elsewhere. This is a story of teamwork, and the smaller than usual team offers up plenty of excitement as they face their highest stakes mission yet, without the usual IMF support. The stakes may be dire, but this film never feels like it. It's easy for spy thrillers to become too self-serious and dour, but Ghost Protocol definitely avoids that, instead injecting just the right amount of levity and fun self-awareness to balance out the tone. And of course, we can't forget about the action. It's since been topped by later films in the franchise, but the action here is fantastic. Prison escapes, sandstorm chases, tons of brawls, and of course, the practically shot, stuntman-free, gravity-defying Burj Khalifa sequence that still remains a highlight of the franchise more than a decade later. Coming in at number 2, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. As with the last time I ranked this franchise, I struggled a bit deciding whether to place this one in the second or third spot. I think I honestly like them about equally, but my recent rewatch reminded me of how fun this one is. This is one of the more plot-driven films in the franchise, with its roots in the tech thriller espionage movies of largely the 90s and 2000s. I'm sure some people will probably scoff a bit at the AI focus and kind of sci-fi leanings of the plot, but I really enjoyed it and think that it fits in nicely with the overarching paranoia and suspicion that are inherent to the espionage genre. The antagonist of the film has some personality this time around, but the character focus is still very much on our core IMF team, full of old favorites and a pretty decent new addition. I do think there's one character that the story handles very poorly, but for the most part, this was an extremely solid and satisfying Part 1 film. As I'm sure you've noticed, I praise the action of all of the mid and high-ranked Mission Impossible movies, and that's not gonna change here. The story's interesting, and the characters are compelling, but the action is once again the highlight. It's possible that this whole one-upping pattern we've seen with each successive film will eventually backfire, but that hasn't happened yet, at least. This is absolutely full of impressive action sequences, big and small alike. From narrow alley fistfights to sandstorm horseback shootouts to death-defying motorcycle work, this film has one memorable action sequence after the next. There's even what we can consider an alternative rock climbing scene. My personal favorite sequence is probably the highly entertaining and chaotic 20-minute long Rome car chase, but this is absolutely packed with stunning action, which, of course, is pretty much all practical, and, of course, performed spectacularly by the then 61-year-old Tom Cruise. So that means my number one Mission Impossible movie is Mission Impossible Fallout. There was a period of time where I thought Ghost Protocol would be the pinnacle of the Mission Impossible franchise. I enjoyed Rogue Nation, but it was a step down overall, so even though I was excited for Fallout, I went in with reasonable expectations, and was promptly blown away by the film. I didn't expect Fallout to be the best Mission Impossible movie, and I certainly didn't expect it to be the best action movie of the decade, but it was unabashedly both of those things, and continues to be the highlight of the franchise. It takes an initially straightforward story with familiar spy thriller elements, but then adds twists, turns, and nuance to craft an engaging story that's equal parts exciting and thought-provoking. The plot is great here, but it's coupled with some of the most compelling character moments we've seen since the third film, exploring Ethan's fallibility as well as his motivations and priorities. These might seem like slightly less important elements in a bombastic action film, but that emotion and character focus is part of what helps set this one apart from the rest. Of course, I can't talk about Fallout without discussing the action. Now, the action has been a consistently impressive part of the franchise since Mission Impossible 3, ramping up with bigger and more exciting stunts with each new film. So, it's a little hard to believe that they could manage to somehow still go bigger here, but the action is simply phenomenal. Each well-paced action set piece has something to offer. Excitement, tension, entertainment, jaw-dropping awe, or most often, some combination of all of these things. The action serves the story, so it's never just throwaway action for action's sake, and the variety keeps audiences from ever getting bored or overstimulated. There's skydiving, hard-hitting brawls, numerous escapes, foot chases, car chases, motorcycle chases, helicopter chases, even some throwback rock climbing for good measure. And in franchise tradition, it's all done practically, usually by Tom Cruise himself. Alright, so that's my rankography of the Mission Impossible franchise. 8 movies, way too many masks, and not nearly enough stunt doubles. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so be sure to post it in the comments below. Remember, I've already reviewed all 8 of these movies, so you could check those videos out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're on it so you can see more rankographies like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.